Chapter 11. That night I dreamed, half awake, half sleeping. I'd sit up eyeing the crack under the door, wondering if it was morning, worrying about being late. Then I'd fall back, remembering what Anna had taught me. Wild garlic and honey for coughs, leaves, stems, and roots of shelf heel watered and stirred into a foo-far froth and strained. Was that for fever? I tried to remember. Anna must have told me dozens of cures, stuffing them into my head the way you'd stuff potatoes into a rush bowl. Potatoes. Don't think about potatoes, I told myself and turned over, the straw rustling under me. The next morning I was up earlier than I had ever been. I said my prayers as I went, not taking time to kneel next to the bed. I had to be at Malin's house before their rooster crowed. I wasn't so hungry now. Strange, because we had gone to bed with headaches and stomach aches and Patch crying the way he had while Maggie walked away to Galwayport. I sang an old song of Da's to comfort him until Celia threw a handful of bed straw at me and Granda told us to say our prayers and close our eyes. Now, I crossed the field watching for the Malin brothers. I had to be sure they wouldn't get themselves down to the strand before I reached them. I thought about last night coming in through the open door, my wrist stinging from one of the long nettles, but hardly paying attention to it, mouth watering over the potatoes that Celia would be cooking. It was a good plan, Granda, I'd said. We're through the day, and it's time for a meal. But Celia had shaken her head. The small pile of potatoes we had picked so carefully seemed shrunken, and the spots had spread and run into each other, leaving ridges of black. Celia bit her lip. We have to get rid of these, she said. We can't eat them. We'll cut the spots out, I said. We'll do it carefully, then we'll boil the good parts. You suppose they'll make us sick? Celia asked. We have to try, Granda said. Celia looked at Muck in her corner pen. We'll give her a wee bit first and see what happens. I'm glad I'm not the pig. I reached for the first potato and the knife that swung on its hook and began to cut. It took a long time. The potatoes were small to begin with, and when I was finished, the pile would fit in Patch's cap. We boiled what we had anyway, but there was no need to test them out in Muck. In front of our eyes, the bubbling water turned dark and the same dreadful smell from the fields was on us. After Celia had thrown the whole mess out in the yard, pot, water, and pratties, we'd gone down to Cunningham's stream. We'd taken a bowl of his water and a few of his leaves back to the boil for a bit of soup. But there was no time now to daydream about yesterday. The Malin brothers were just ahead of me under the crotch. I called out to them, and the muffled sound of their hello came back across the field. I ran toward them. Let me come with you. They didn't stop. I won't take up much room, I told them. I'll sit on the bottom between the seats. All I need is a line and a hook. They moved away from me. Michael's voice came from under the crotch. There's no room, Nory, and you don't know how to fish beyond the surf. Please, I said. Please. I could hear Liam, too. Ah, Nory. He was saying, ah. Was he feeling sorry for me? Suddenly I was angry. Angrier than I could ever remember. I picked up a stone and threw it as hard as I could. It bounced off the crotch with a small thud. What was that? Michael asked. Let me come, I called. But they angled the crotch up and over the stile and started down the path toward the strand. I walked in back of them all the way, yelling, wanting to cry the way Patch had last night. At last they took pity on me. They rested the crotch in their hands and ducked their heads so I could see their faces. Nory Ryan, said Michael, I know you're hungry. We are all hungry. Let me, I began again, but I could see by their faces that the answer was no. Listen, Liam said, wait here for Sean. He's coming soon to pick up the limpets and the mussels along the shore. Limpets, I said? Foo-far. If you are hungry enough, you'll eat them. Michael blew his red hair out of his eyes, and I think before we are finished, we'll be glad to have even that. I didn't say another word. I was still angry, and besides, I needed a pail. Go up to the house, Liam said, knowing what I was thinking. Someone will give you a pail. They grunted with the weight of the crotch as they went along the sandy path, but I didn't waste time watching them. I turned and walked up to the door of the Malin house. Bless all here, I called in through the open doorway. Granny Malin sat on her heels near the fire, smoking her pipe, and Mrs. Malin was at the hearth. They both nodded. Dia tweet, Nory. Is Sean here, I began, and I could have a pail, please? Mrs. Malin jerked her thumb over her shoulder. A pail outside, and Sean around the back of the house. I could see how hungry Sean was as I turned the corner. He had always been skinny, but overnight the color had gone from his face, and his eyes were huge, like patches. We'll catch us some foo-far limpets, I said, and some black mussels, too. He smiled at me, patting his pockets, looking for Dulce, I knew. Then we started for the path to the beach. I loved this path. As the path turned one way, we'd see a bit of the sea, and then as it wandered another, the sea would be lost, and the grasses would be as high as our heads, and blowing with the sound of whispers, music just for us. As we went down, the cliffs in back of us rose higher and higher, and the gannets and kestrels wheeled and dipped. I thought that Brooklyn, New York, America, could have been as beautiful even with its diamond streets. We were at the last turn now. I knew what I'd see next. The sea stretched out in front of us, waves crashing onto our little strand, with not a soul in sight except for the Malins as they ran into the surf with the Karach. I stepped at the end of the path, my mouth open. The strand was filled with people. People I never saw at the water's edge, people I saw only during the time of the fair. They had walked a long way to get here. Some gathered seaweed and the others looked for limpets and mussels. Our mussels, our Fuafar limpets. Sean and I looked at each other. "Hurry," he said. We began to run, the sand dragging at our feet. At the water's edge we started to dig, getting into everyone's way, splashing the sand under our nails and crushed shells biting at our feet. Around us people called to each other. Suddenly it was silent, as silent as it could be with the waves running high and throwing themselves up on the rocks at our feet. What was happening? I looked first at the Karach. It was just beyond the waves now, and Leah and Micah were bent over the oars. Next to me, a woman held a small clump of black mussels, her skirt soaked with spray, her mouth opened as she turned, staring. I swiveled around, shading my eyes. Lord Cunningham, on a huge white horse, was coming toward us from the bottom of the path. My heart jumped. Even though I knew it was coming all right to be there, it was not Lord Cunningham's beach after all. It was not his ocean. Still, I knew there'd be trouble. He shouted as he pounded across the strand toward us, the sand spewing up in great circles. Cunningham rode into the surf so that the horse was in water up to his knees and the sea licked at the Lord's boots. "You!" he shouted at the Karach, waving his riding crop over his head. "Come back!" Next to me, Sean shook his head, his face and hair peppered with sand. The Malins stopped rowing, their oars raised, and Cunningham rode another few feet into the surf. Michael said something. I could see anger on his face. Then Liam dipped his oars into the water again. They began to row toward the shore, riding in on a wave, and Sean ran to help them beach the Karach. "What is it?" Sean asked. "What?" Around me, the women were backing away, so there was a space between us. In the middle of the space was Cunningham, the horse, and the Karach at the water's edge. "That Karach belongs to me now," Cunningham screamed. "To me."